Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar with Right Recruiter. My name is Steve Outhouse, and glad you're able to join us here tonight. We've had a growing number of people signing up for our webinars. Many of you watching here this evening, but many more actually getting the video to watch on demand. So we're really glad you're a part of this and glad that you're here. Um, this will date the video for those who choose to watch it, perhaps much later on, but we had a great few days at the Conservative Party convention in Quebec City, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about Right Recruiter and that getting up and running. And a lot of people have had a vision and a desire to see Conservative staffers across all levels of government, have access to training and tools and so on. So a lot of follow up to do on that. Thank you for being a part of it and being here at the ground floor as we get started. And with our aim of helping conservatives get elected and conservative governments re-elected by making sure that we have the people in place, both at the campaign level and on the staffer level, to do an excellent job. So that we earn those votes at the ballot box, and then we earn re-election through what we do as governments and as candidates at other levels of government. So thanks for being here and spending your time with us. Something that we're going to start doing from this point moving forward as well is if you have questions, especially for those of you who aren't able to join us live, when you get the email with the link to watch the webinar, if you want to reply to that with any questions, if you have a question that is burning and you'd like to make sure we ask our guests, please reply with it, and we're happy to gather those up and ask as many as we can. We love the participation element that's there and making sure that we're answering questions that matter to people. So if you when you get your registration link, if you just want to send us a quick note, you're like, not able to make it tonight for the live webinar, but here's my question. So we'll be happy to do that. So let's get ready to dive in here. I want to start by introducing our guest here tonight, and I'm excited about all the guests that we have. One of the things about Right Recruiter is we get to connect with, there's so many great people in our conservative network across the country at all different levels of government and different parts of the movement. And tonight I get to have a very someone whom I respect a lot and is a very good friend of mine, actually. He's had a tremendous impact on my life in many fronts, but perhaps the one that's most directly relevant for the whole where I am career-wise right now is he encouraged me to give Ottawa a try when we were co-op students together in university back in in the 90s, we'll just say. And I moved to Ottawa for a co-op term to kind of dip my feet in the water here, on the government side of things, and really that was a life changer, I guess, in terms of career trajectory. We were roommates at that time. It was our first time being roommates, and we were actually roommates a second time as well. And for those who may have seen us interacting on Twitter in advance of this, I should say our guest name, actually, Andrew House. And Andrew and I on Twitter were going back and forth about when we were roommates. And our second time as roommates, we actually thought it would be wise to save money and have a room with bunk beds in it that we would share. And I can tell you, and we'll get Andrew's take on this in a couple minutes, but for anyone considering a move to Ottawa, I can tell you through experience that is no amount of money that you save is worth having bunk beds with a friend. So just no money's worth it. Just get your own place. Andrew stood at my wedding. I attended his. But in case you think that we're only having him on here tonight because we have been friends for almost 20 years, you're wrong. Andrew's very, very qualified to talk about our topic tonight. Andrew House is a partner at Fasken Law and practices in the areas of foreign investment, government relations, and political law, with a focus on the impact of national security considerations in federally regulated industries and transactions. So for over 2 decades, Andrew has provided strategic and legal advice to corporate leaders, policymakers, and cabinet members. Andrew served from 2010 to 2015 as Chief of Staff to successive ministers of public safety and emergency preparedness, working with his team to manage some of the most critical files facing the government of Canada in the areas of national security, policing, borders and trade, and disaster response. These included foreign direct investment, cybersecurity, irregular migration, and anti-terrorism. Andrew, also on the political side, the overtly, or I guess the campaign side of things, Andrew has stood twice as a CPC candidate. The first time in 2006 in Halifax against NDP leader Alexa McDonough, actually, and then again in 2008 in central Newfoundland and Labrador. He is 0 for 2, but he says he plans to keep it that way. So I say never. But let's bring him up here now on screen. And thank you, Andrew, for joining us here for our Right Recruiter webinar tonight.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. I just want you to know I've always thought of you as, in my life, a real top bunk kind of guy. And I would do it again. I would do it again tomorrow.
Wow, that means a lot. Yeah, I guess because it's only theoretical, we can say, sure, yeah, that would be fine. I just remember when we went back to Halifax, where we were both doing university. I think there was probably a couple months afterwards we didn't really speak. It was just sort of like, yeah, we spent a lot of time together that summer.
Just needed to decompress. That's all. It was all a bit much, and I think it passed quickly, and then we saw each other again. I invited you for sleepover, and you were just you just didn't didn't have it in you anymore.
Let's just see a movie instead.
Yeah.
So I actually noticed some of our university friends had signed up for tonight's webinar. So perhaps they're here just for this, just walk down memory lane, and we'll see what the questions come up in the chat later. So thanks for joining us here tonight. We're really glad you could be here. I didn't really set up the topic, so I'll do that now. What we've asked Andrew to come and speak on is the dividing line between a ministerial office and the public service. And so this is something that's appropriate for if you're a staffer on any, whether provincial, federal side. I mean, this is a skill and it's a skill set that you need to learn and know and, avoid stepping over lines that can cause, you and your boss some very real trouble and real issues. And in fact, maybe some Liberal staffers might be tuning into this one tonight because of the public safety side of things. I think the current government's gone through some recent examples of this, of perhaps maybe some lines that are crossed or maybe should have been not crossed or what have you. And we'll get into that. But Andrew is, I think, uniquely positioned to kind of walk us through what that line is, how to avoid tripping over it. And we're going to take kind of a perspective of sort of a global approach that we should all be aware of if we're in minister's office. And then we'll get into some specifics about public safety as well, just because it's a fascinating topic and one that, is really fraught with, I think we put that in the promo, I mean, it's fraught with peril, I mean, real political and even legal peril. So, Andrew, we always ask folks the same thing as to get started. And I've done enough sort of talking here. So we want to start to make sure that you get to start sharing your wisdom and dropping those wise words to our friends who are here tonight. How about you start, though, with just letting us know how you became a staffer? Like, what was your staffer journey, and what was the first staffer role that you took on?
So if I'm being perfectly truthful, we've already confessed one element of our background. I started life as a staffer, not as a Conservative, but as a Liberal. My first staffing job on the Hill was Special Assistant Atlantic to the Minister of Veterans Affairs. And that was my childhood MP, George Baker, later a senator, and a guy that I still keep in touch with and consider a friend and a mentor. And, I like to think that a lot of the best Conservatives started in that camp. And we could run the list. It's always good fun. I grew up in central Newfoundland. This was an article of faith that you were a Liberal. I had a great relationship with my local MP. And that's the first taste of the Hill that I got. And it was watching my minister be decommissioned over a point of principle, namely where shrimp caught off the coast of Newfoundland should be processed, Newfoundland or PEI. I have a mixed allegiance there coming from both of those heritages. Watching George go down out of cabinet on that point of principle, being sort of read the Riot Act in that context, that that broke something for me about that system, and that was a tough first experience in politics, and I like to think I learned from it.
Mm-hmm. Now, but you made the switch as many did, and myself included. I mean, for very early years, yes, had been I involved a bit in the Liberal Party, and I'll share with you just quickly. I remember a fundraiser once where when the now late Royal Gallipo was our MP here in Orleans. He shared that I was at a fundraising dinner one night, and he shared that he was a former Liberal, or Jason Kenney was there speaking, and he talked about how he was a young Liberal. Everyone laughed and cheered, and he said, and Royal Gallipo was, and everyone laughed and cheered. And then I got up to thank the speaker as I was the EDA president, and I said, and I was a former Liberal too, and everyone booed until I sat down. So anyway, I just wanted to come out in solidarity with you there about our past.
Good.
So, but we both have made a shift to the right, very notably. And it shaped both of our careers, and and that's why we're here tonight. So, can you talk us through sort of your the different roles that you've had since then, and what path you took along in the staffer route?
So a completely unplanned and eclectic path, and I think it's always fun to talk to people who are entering politics now or at the beginning of their career. They will often ask, like, what was the magic? Like, what did you get a really excellent career coach, which I think is a great idea. But what I usually tell people is just follow what you're really interested in. I was interested in international affairs. So I went to the UN of all places. I'm beginning to have terrible conservative credentials, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
Bear with me. I was also a legal aid lawyer for a while. Like it's really bad, but then it gets good. And overseas, I watched Canada's place in the world evaporate. It was a NATO mission of some 40,000 troops at certain times, and Canada had 3 people in mission. Like, we just weren't there. We weren't present, in large part because we couldn't. We didn't have the right equipment. We didn't have the right personnel, or we couldn't deploy them. We obviously have amazing personnel. We just weren't ready. And that really began to twist my view on liberalism versus conservatism, how a nation is built, what are the fundamentals of a country and a nation state. Fundamental to that, the ability to defend oneself or exert sovereignty, to project your power overseas. And that was kind of the breaking point for me when I came back to Canada after a year in Kosovo. It was to a legal aid job where I wanted to be a Crown prosecutor, and that evolution was underway in a crime and justice sense. But you got to do a tour in legal aid, and seeing how people sometimes gamed the system. The level of knowledge on the part of a lot of people propelled me into a real interest in conservative politics. I encountered Stockwell Day's son in legal circles. Luke Day introduced me to the conservative movement and tricked me into running against Alexa McDonough. I thought we were building a leadership team, a nomination team for Luke, which I was very pleased to do. And then one day he just handed me the keys and said, I'm moving to Alberta and you're it. Mm-hmm. And it went from there. I got invited to, I lost an election really badly and had an amazing time doing it, and met all kinds of people from Ottawa. And when it was all over, was invited to work for the Attorney General and came to Ottawa for the first time in that capacity.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder to folks, so I've got some questions here that I'm going to start going through with Andrew, but we'd love to hear what you have to say and questions you might have. So if you want to pop those in the chat, we'll grab those as we keep going. So let's start with just some factual basis, and Andrew, just so folks have an understanding and appreciation for the complexity of the public safety portfolio. In the minister's office there, what agencies, what departments fall under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness?
So when I was chief at Public Safety, you had one minister responsible for 5 agencies and the department proper. So you're looking at the Correctional Service, the Border Guards, the RCMP, CSIS, the Intelligence Service, and the Parole Board of Canada. And it was always the Parole Board that kind of got left behind, which was not something I'm proud of, but it was the least violent and least volatile. They didn't have guns, so we took a little more time with the others. Then you had the juggernaut of emergency management, and that's managed by the department proper. I mean, on the ground, it's the function of the provinces, but when you get into major disasters, public safety really kicks into high gear, liaises with the Department of National Defense, and really has to be present on the ground for what's called the disaster financial assistance arrangements. It is a big and brutal place in the sense that you have about 60,000 officials for whom you are accountable through your minister and to Parliament. Many of those people are in harm's way. Many of them are armed. They're in actual physical conflict a lot of the time, and that means it's really operationally and legally complex and a bit gut wrenching. The middle of the night calls that someone's been hurt or we've hurt someone, that was very, very regularized, and that I think was, and I hate to admit this because it's a bit morbid. That was part of the attraction, was the pace of it and the depth and the complexity. And it was also the horror of it. It went on for me for 5 years, which is probably 3 years too long. And I just couldn't give it up and went to the bitter end.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've outlined some pretty controversial and pretty or complex, I guess, types of agencies and departments. I mean, to try to keep track of everything that's going on. I mean, that's got to be, would you say that's one of the biggest tasks you've ever taken on? I mean, in your personal and professional career?
Other than raising children, yes. You can't fire your kids. You can't actually, it's really complex. That's a whole other webinar.
Yeah.
Not good command and control. We're working on it. The job at public safety, and I boldly announced this the first time we sat at a table together as a team in 2010. I said, guys, this is the most important job that I will ever have. And it's very likely the most important job that you will ever have. One of our team members, Brandon Leslie, is now an MP. I'm going to say that's the most important job, but up to that point, in terms of responsibility, the ability to allow or permit harm to others, this is it. And so it was a big, weighty thing. And I think that the key was the team that we assembled and the fact that they stood together resolutely. And that team cycled through year over year. We would see people go to PMO and come back. We'd see people go to other departments and come back. And that institutional knowledge, expertise, and experience held the thing together.
Yeah. So you made reference to the team, and I have a huge appreciation for teamwork, as you know. But working together, and so this is what we're going to get into now, kind of from the staffer's perspective, and we'll talk specifically about public safety, more as we go. But I mean, again, as I referenced at the beginning, the reason that we thought you would be particularly adept at walking through how to not cross these lines and so on is because public safety has such concrete examples of lines that can or can't be crossed. If you overstep, you get in real trouble. But if you let the bureaucracy overstep their bounds and don't exercise ministerial authority as truly appropriate, then other people can decide your political fate for you. And that can even have electoral impacts as well. So I'm going to ask you some specific about public safety or some questions about that in a moment. But before we do that, what would you say to any and all staffers going into work in ministerial offices? How do they find out what the limits are of what they can and can't do? And now, are there rules that they should read or guidelines that they should make sure that they're familiar with? And are there things that apply to all ministers' offices? And I mean, I appreciate that your circumstances would be all federal in nature, but are there things that apply to all ministerial offices versus items that vary by minister by minister?
So I think that the top line answer to this is the one that we are all given when we arrive in a minister's office, which is you need to get your ethical house in order. All those declarations, you need to be highly aware of the rules around lobbying, because you're going to be lobbied, and federally you're a designated public office holder. Contacts with you are reportable. This is super important stuff, but it's very familiar to people. What we don't really talk about for some bizarre reason is, have you read the constating document of your department? To use a big fancy word. It's just it's the marching orders from Parliament for why your department exists and why the agencies, if you're in a portfolio, why they exist. So that'd be number one. Read that act. What is this place about? What are the things we do here? Secondly, what powers are granted to your minister by Parliament? And which of those powers has he lawfully delegated to an official? And are those delegations appropriate? And this is where things get pretty tough. I mean, you have to read all of the applicable legislation. And if you're a new staffer in a minister's office, you're just trying to find the bathroom, that's a big deal. CBSA is responsible for 98 separate statutes. And we didn't read them all, I assure you, but we read the ones that were going to be most relevant to us. The RCMP Act, huge. And just to answer your question, are these principles that are relevant to any ministerial office? Yes. Every minister carries with him or her statutory duties, and they are responsible to the legislature for a department that's administering an act or a number of acts. And then thirdly, and this is critical because it's been so much in the news recently, do the acts in question entail powers of enforcement? Or put differently, powers that create rules that, if broken, will entail a punishment, maybe even a punishment that would entail the deprivation of personal freedom, like jail time. If you're in that kind of department, you are in a special and dangerous place, as our Liberal cousins have so brutally discovered repeatedly. And I'm not sorry, I'm going to say something quite partisan. I'm not certain why they were given the ability to discover this on multiple occasions. Once is enough. And now let me say something a little more collegial. You have my full sympathy, Liberal friends. If there's any listening, the training just is usually not there. Not everyone comes to the job with a law degree. And if you do, chances are your law degree wasn't specific to how to speak to the Mounties in a safe way. And I had the privilege of having independent counsel in my office, imposed by PMO and warmly welcomed by me. And boy, did we make use of that guy over and over and over and again. This is someone a lot of people know, Tom Jarman. And his job on a daily basis, go and figure out how we can appropriately be accountable to Parliament and have influence, again, appropriately over what our agency is doing in this sensitive case. And it was a very narrow path.
So I want to dive into that. Fred's got a great question here. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment here in the chat, but I want to pick up on something very specific. And this is, we're going to go from big picture right down to the minutia really quickly here. But you talked about what powers are granted by Parliament to your minister, and then what powers he or she is delegated lawfully to, the deputy minister or an assistant commissioner or what have you. How do you find that out? And is the way you usually find that out when a problem comes up? I mean, or does anyone ever sit there at the beginning when they get in on day two, they're like, let's get our briefing from the department. Now, I remember what those briefings are like. You sit down in a boardroom and they come in and they basically spray you with more information than you can possibly consume at one time. So I don't ever recall, and perhaps it was done because I wasn't on the policy side or the legislative side, but I don't recall sitting down and saying, okay, so what can a fisheries officer do, for example? Because even and that's another thing I think to point out to, for friends who may be in federal ministers' offices, perhaps after the next election, is that there's a lot more enforcement arms than one might think. Like, you think of the RCMP or CBSA, but you don't think about fisheries officers or Environment Canada actually having people who can, go on property and take action as well. So how did you do that? Like, is that something you would recommend? There should be something that, future chiefs of staff who might be watching this should go and ask for a list of these things at the beginning? Or is it truly you just, until something becomes a problem, you can't really start to wonder if it's going to be a problem?
So I think that an ounce of prevention, it really is worth that pound of cure. Sometimes you can't be cured from these situations. You have interfered, and you can't bridge away from that. And I'll tell you, the answers are not always in the act. I can, if you'll let me, I'll nerd out for a second, and well, I'll just quote it because I can't really find it. The RCMP Act, Section 5 of the Act, could literally lead you down a very bad path if you read it in isolation. It says that there will be a force, there will be a commissioner of the RCMP who, under the direction of the minister, shall administer the RCMP. I'm paraphrasing slightly. Mm-hmm. You take the time to get the act out and read that, you'd say, okay, I have gone above and beyond. I have read the act. I now know what we can do. We're going to direct the commissioner to do this, that, and the other thing. The problem is that you also have to take into account the common law, like the actual court-made criminal law of our country, which is often formed by the court-made criminal law of other countries, namely the United Kingdom. To answer your question as concisely as possible, I would, if you are in a department with enforcement powers where someone can be fined or can go to jail, you look up a case called Campbell and Charose. It's the Supreme Court of Canada. There's one paragraph. We could just send it to everyone. You can
let's do that.
Blast it out. I wish every chief of staff would just read this paragraph to incoming staff. And what it says is, in quoting British jurisprudence, that the minister cannot tell the constable where to stand or how to keep watch or which man to investigate or not investigate. Again, paraphrasing slightly. Mm-hmm. So you've got this power to direct the RCMP, but you can't use it in regard to an individual investigation or person. Hmm. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, let's take the example of, you remember the blockades of railways. This is like just pre-pandemic. And a huge controversy arose about whether the government should tell the RCMP to do something about this. And the current government said, no way, we don't direct the RCMP. And it was the wrong answer. Legally, it's the wrong answer. You could choose not to do that, but you're not bound to do that. You can direct the RCMP to place emphasis on certain law enforcement priorities. For instance, the preservation of the functionality of critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Write them a letter, cite Section 5, and you will be engaged in an act of good governance. By contrast, if you say, I want that individual at that blockade who I'm watching on live TV lighting something on fire, I want him arrested now. That is illegal. Mm-hmm. Even if you put it in writing and quote Section 5, still illegal. Mm-hmm. That's somewhat, I realize, complex, but not terribly complex. Concepts, fine. Emphasis, fine. People, not fine.
So concepts and emphasis, fine. That's the big picture of, we as a government, or myself as a minister, I guess, is saying this is important, and this is an issue that we, wish the force to place an emphasis on, but directing them to do it in a specific way. It's almost like more of like a higher, an overarching direction versus a specific operational way of looking at things.
It's exactly it. And do it openly. Put it in writing. Put that writing on the newswire. Tweet it out. Doing these things openly and transparently under the authority of both the Act and the common law, it's just the only way to live in this environment. Honesty is the best policy. Wear it proudly, or don't do it.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a question here from Fred. Fred's one of our faithful participants in these, and I got to meet Fred when I was working on the campaign out in Alberta. Fred's a great guy, and this kind of builds where I wanted to go. And he puts it well. It's like, how do you differentiate between your quote unquote public fate and the powers granted and the ethical principles involved in the decision? And my question was kind of along those lines to say, I mean, how do you stop yourself, and what advice can you give, a new staffer who's stepping into these roles? I mean, the temptation has to be so strong if let's just say you're watching someone set something on fire on live television. There's a burning inside you. You're like, this is wrong, and this needs to be dealt with. And, it's got to feel super gratifying to, pound your fist on the table and tell someone in a uniform to go get that bad guy. Like, you're doing the right thing. What sort of advice do you have to show restraint in those situations, But then I'd like to build it to the next part, which is what Fred's getting to, which is, but if you know that something's wrong and something's not working, what powers do you have to start making things better? If we all get into this line of work to try to make things better. So there's a lot there. I'll just now, good luck unpacking it.
So, first and foremost, we're conservatives. We believe Parliament is supreme. Respect the will of Parliament. Parliament has delegated statutory authority to a minister in an act of Parliament. First of all, respect that authority by reading the act. Like, get to know your department's key pieces of legislation. Understand the basic legal overlay. And I know this is starting to be complicated, but the black letter law in one act is not usually the full answer. And I'm giving you an example in the criminal law. In fact, any area of penal consequence where someone can go to jail. Once you have that firmly in mind, the fact that you see something on TV allows you to connect the facts to the law. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do this. If you can read, you can do this. And showing the restraint to say, I am not going to start making phone calls, screaming at people in uniform to do their job when that is illegal. But I'm going to be smart about this. I'm going to immediately resort to the plan that we have discussed in advance, which is we are going to provide direction on on law enforcement emphasis in no uncertain terms. We're going to deal with the public comms or public fate issue by quickly making it clear that we have provided a direction. Here it is. It's an appropriate direction. I guess, Steve, my point is, don't fight angry, fight smart. Don't get yourself in a situation where even good officials, and there are many, are saying, no, I in good faith, I cannot go along with what you have directed. I question your personal authority. You're not the minister. I don't know if you're speaking in his name here or not. Always very awkward. You got to build that trust. And I question your legal authority. Why not take those legal principles, the will of Parliament, and you turn that to your advantage? You will find that the system, once you've substantiated your case and you've laid out in advance, this is what we're doing in time of crisis, they will move. And even if they don't immediately move, you've insulated yourself in a public comm sense. You've demonstrated your authority.
Joseph is asked a question here that I'd like to tie into this, which is, could you walk through the more basic responsibilities of a chief of staff and a look at your day-to-day duties would be interesting. And I see a couple of people have liked that already. So that's, I think, a good question. And then to tie that specifically into this, public safety example of, making sure that everyone is rowing in that same direction, that you don't have someone on your team, like, fine, you're all sitting at your staff meeting. Well, I'll let you talk about your meetings and so on, but there's an agreed upon path forward as a ministerial team, and then someone doesn't go off and just sort of take it upon themselves to try to dole out justice and get officials to do what they're looking for.
So this is a great question. What I'm going to say is for some people going to be just utterly basic. For others, it may strike them as a brand new thing, and maybe you'll have a whole spectrum in between. The first thing to do in the day-to-day of a chief of staff is create an org chart, publish it, make people live by it. You have the authority to do that. You've got the power of hiring and firing. If you don't have that power, get it from your minister, or else get a different job. Like, you have to chief the staff, or there isn't a point. One of the best things you can do to foster a good staff and respect a good staff once you have one is to just let them know what their job is and what someone else's job is, and hold them accountable to their job and only their job, and ask them not to do someone else's job unless you've asked them to in an emergency. In other words, you have authority as chief of staff. You're delegating authority on those files, and you're asking people to respect that delegation. But it's published and it's clear. It's even published to the department so that people understand very clearly the lines of communication and authority. And then you as chief have to respect that. I got jammed a couple of times, quite rightly, by senior staff in our former office, director level, who said to me, listen, I was managing that thing, and then an ADM snuck in your office, had a big heart-to-heart with you, like tears and all, and you did what they asked you to do without checking with me. It happened to me twice. And I remember because it was a grievous mistake both times. And I ended up reversing what I had decided and told the ADM and apologizing profusely to those directors. It's bad management. So one, make sure your people know what their jobs are and stick to those jobs. You stick to them, they stick to them. Apologize in reverse if you've undermined them in any way. And next, what I would say, Steve, is enforce, and I'm going to use a funny term given the context, enforce a safe space in which people can be heard. Enforce people to be heard. And I say that sounds a little forceful, but in that sacred morning meeting that I always found so useful, make sure, as we always did, that everyone is not only given a turn to speak, but an obligation to speak up if they know something. You always have big personalities in these meetings. Almost everyone who assembles in politics is an A-type personality, and aggressively so. And then you have sometimes one or two, often policy people, kind of just, once the issues management guys and the comms people are done sort of duking it out, the policy people tend to hang back sometimes, not always, sometimes, and just keep their own counsel. The chief's most important job, I think, run the schedule, first of all, make sure the minister knows where he's supposed to be. Secondly, draw forward those hidden views, those opinions that you can tell a person is like, should I say this or should I not? And I'd apply that to officials as well, making sure that officials have an opportunity to be heard. And then, you do have the role of chief diplomat and chief enforcer. These are things to be held in tension. And I'll finish on this point. And this is, I'm kind of going on because this is something that you and I talked about in advance. And I feel passionately about this point. Make sure that if you're a chief of staff, that you don't actually need the job, that you are ready to say this far and no further, either to your minister, to PMO, to the department. I won't do that. And if that's a problem for you, that's okay. I genuinely wish you well. I'll even make recommendations, but I'm not continuing. I'm not going to leave overnight unless what you're asking is an overnight problem. And what do I mean by a problem? I mean an illegality, a sharp illegality or something that will put people in harm's way. You don't need the job. Make sure that you have an out and that you're prepared to exercise it. It will make you a better chief of staff.
Yeah, that's great advice. It can be hard to do. And I think that sometimes, I've seen people battle with, the desire, do I need to walk away about this? And sometimes I think, I think that the criteria that you have, and I think it's good that you ask yourself that question as a staffer going into an office, what are my boundaries and things like that, sharp illegality or, putting someone's, health and safety at risk. Those are very serious and clear standards. I've seen people want to quit because they didn't get their way on, messaging or two successive social media posts. Why am I even here? It's just this is not a principle. This is you. We're part of a team. Let's all just, pull through. So I think that's great advice. It takes a tremendous amount of courage, I think, to, say to a minister or PMO this is my line, but I do think it's important that we all do that and understand that. And I wanted to circle back to what you're talking about, the org chart and clarity. This is at its heart kind of where Right Recruiter. One of the main goals of Right Recruiter is to say these fundamental things because. Boy, oh boy, you get tossed into one of these offices and you start running at 90 miles an hour. And even just the way the Canadian system is set up, for all levels of government here, unlike the States where, a president is elected and then there's months of transition and it's a known date of transition and you have time to hire, to appoint your cabinet and they hire staff. And then when you take over government on day one, everyone shows up, together. In the Canadian system, again, I believe it's completely the same at the provincial level. Premiers or prime minister appoints their cabinet, and they're not allowed to tell anyone, or it's threatened to be taken away from them. So they don't dare, speak to people about becoming their chief of staff or come take on a staff job or things like that. And so when they get in there on day one, usually who's there? A couple, bureaucrats who are seconded, like I was. That was where my story began. Come into a minister's office. And a whole slew, an army of public servants who are there ready to help the minister with whatever he or she needs, and there's no staff around them. So when staff join, they often have to catch up on everything that's happened, and they're already sprinting and out of breath by week one. So I think clarity and understanding people's roles and responsibility is it's absolutely critical. So thank you for that. So let's go to pick up on this now. Oh, actually, sorry. One more part, and we mentioned PMO. It could be a premier's office and so on as well. It's one thing to have, you're the chief of staff and you have staff that report to you and you have that hiring and firing ability. But the role with the center, be it a premier's office or the prime minister's office, is a little more nuanced. And maybe they can't directly fire you. Sometimes maybe they can. How do you make sure that they're staying in line too? Because on the issues management side, like you said, some of these issues are now, they're raging, they're in the media, and someone at the center and issues managers wants this to go away, understandably so, and even more understandably so, doesn't want it just to be papered over, wants this legitimately dealt with. They have all the best intentions, but there's some real boundaries there. How do you manage that relationship with the center?
So I think that this is easier said than actually done. We all remember those days of the issues management meeting, first thing in the morning. We had the benefit of a crazy good issues manager that was able to withstand more punishment than any other human that I've ever encountered. Mark Johnson has no adrenal glands. He's just steady the whole time. And, he would bring to us just horrific problems and these endlessly complex questions, or questions that had endlessly complex answers. And one of the things we had to seriously do is discuss, is our minister exercising a statutory authority given to him by Parliament? The Prime Minister of Canada is primus inter pares. He's first among equals, but he's still part of a cabinet. He's not a king. And this gets lost on people sometimes. Again, this is easier talked about in a webinar than lived out in an issues management call. But the Liberals have learned this so brutally in the last couple of years. When a minister is exercising a statutory authority, an authority that says the minister shall decide, you can't substitute the word the prime minister, or the word the prime minister's director of policy, or the prime minister's chief of staff, or director of issues. None of these things work. They can provide advice, they can evaluate, they can ask really tough questions within bounds. And you saw this with Jody Wilson-Raybould, how questions morphed from appropriate to totally inappropriate. She went from explaining the system to being utterly badgered in her role. It was illegal. Well, we now live in the cold light of that history. I would love to think that when Conservatives retake government, that these lessons are top of mind. And it's why we have to build a really good cabinet. If we're going to cloak ministers with authority, because Parliament has, and accountability, because that's the Westminster tradition, you have to leave them alone to a very large extent to do their jobs. It doesn't mean you're not integrated, that you're not planning announcements, that you're not doing all of the things that are required to run good government, but it does mean that you must respect their statutory authorities. It means the stakes are really high. And you saw the frailty of the current government in the pandemic, where nobody knew what to do. And this is not only a frailty of this government, it's a frailty of the Westminster system, where you have to choose from amongst people who make up, you don't have to, but by convention, you choose from amongst the 338 people in Parliament, and they are almost by definition generalists. And you've got to pick good people, which means you have to elect right people, good people and right people. That would be very helpful. And we also have a desperate need. And let me make the gratuitous observation that someone like you pre-positioning people who are vetted, who are ready to do these jobs and are trained in many of the things that we've talked about tonight, that makes all the difference. When you have good staff who can reinforce a good minister's good instincts to stand firm on the exercise of a statutory authority, you won't have these horrific unforced errors. And there's also the other side of the coin. Exercise the powers that you do have appropriately, vigorously, and proactively. And here I look at someone like Marco Mendicino, by all accounts, a smart enough man, a Crown prosecutor, and a nice guy who just was not on top of his brief. And the horrifying aftermath, not just for him, for the families of the victims involved, chiefly, for the officials who got blamed unjustifiably, in my view, and for, frankly, the minister himself, who, had he been properly briefed, not just on a correct timeline, but properly briefed on his ability to recommend a change in regs or direct certain things appropriately, he could still be with us today, and he is not.
Yeah. We've got the pace is picking up here in the comments, so I'm going to just dive in there and go through as many of these as we can in our time remaining. Question from Grant, who mentions that two former ministers have both told him that their number one piece of advice for a new minister is to get rid of the deputy minister and bring in a new one of their choosing. You think that's good advice? You like that?
No, not necessarily. I'm going to say something that many people may object to who are listening. There are some excellent officials out there. And when you make enemies of excellent officials, you do yourself such a disservice. You open up a vast new array of battles that you don't need to be fighting, when you should be fighting not just your political opponents, but frankly, the genuine problems facing this country. Public safety was a place where we had enough problems that were literally naturally occurring: forest fires and floods, terrorism, literal attacks on our seat of democracy. Yes, we were concerned about the Liberals, but I'm going to confess to you, I was more concerned about people with guns approaching the Hill. And I felt that
Liberals don't have those.
They don't. They refuse to have anything to do with guns. Another debate. I don't think that's lacking in political acumen. I think that's putting first things first. It's discharging the first duty of every government, which is to the safety and security of its citizens. And now I've talked myself into a situation where I can't remember your question.
About whether or not it's good to replace the deputy right off the top.
Don't fire a good deputy, and don't define good deputy by whether or not the deputy does everything you say instantaneously. One of the best things about my time at public safety was when it was all over, hearing from senior officials that, you know what, I often disagreed with you vehemently, Andrew, but I really appreciated that you heard me. You let me speak at the table. In fact, you enforced space in which to brief, so that I knew that night when I went home that Vic Taves had heard me, that Stephen Blaney had heard the words that I felt needed to be said, and that no one made fun of me. You didn't often do what I asked or what I recommended, but I felt that you were fully seized with the facts, the policy, the law, and the stakeholder considerations, and I slept well. That's the name of the game. And you'll find that you make a lot of friends in officialdom, not because you find all the secret conservatives, although there are many, but because you show respect to people and letting them be heard, and not laughing at them. There is so much damage done in decision making, including in conservative circles, because we won't allow people to express a view other than that which is strictly orthodoxy. The second you step outside it, you're a squish, you're a liberal. We don't need more liberals. Hold on a minute. Like, let the words be spoken, evaluate them honestly, make a decision. You know who was good at this? Stephen Harper. Very, very good at the cabinet table. Calm, controlled, confident. You can always tell a confident person because they can take a briefing without their whole face contorting into rage. Now, I've seen Stephen Harper's face contort into rage. Sometimes it was well-deserved, but it usually wasn't because he was hearing something inconvenient. Calmly took it on board, calmly reflected back decision-making. That's good government.
Okay. Moving on to Talisha. So thanks, Grant, for that. Very great question. Talisha's got a question here. Says, what's the best piece of advice you received at any point in your career as a political staffer?
Hire Talisha Thorogood was an excellent piece of advice, and we
all received that advice.
Yes. Bring her directly into Ron Ambrose's office because it was a great place and a great fit. Hi, Talisha. I think honestly, it wasn't a piece of advice so much as an allegation that I had to live with, and it was that undermining of my own team, where the deputy minister did not like what a director was saying to an ADM and just did an end run. And I'm sort of repeating a previous point. And the DM gets in my office and we're having tea together and he's telling me his life troubles. Great guy. You know, I had developed a rapport with multiple deputies. And I said, you know what? Fine. Let's just do that without consulting my director. And as it turns out, there were a series of facts that I didn't know. It was a brutal mistake. And the advice was, don't do that again. And honestly, I did it once more. I'm going to confess to you. And I never, ever did it again, because you assemble a great team for a reason. You pay them comfortable money to live an incredibly uncomfortable life, and you place your full trust in them. Don't undermine them. And I think that's the hardest lesson that I learned among many. And it's the one that I would pass on to others.
I just want to applaud that comment, Andrew. I mean, I think it's a testament to your character. And I think I stole this from a book I read a long time ago. When you're hiring people, we always talk about hiring for character, competence, and chemistry. You needed all three of those if you wanted to have a really great hire. So someone who you could trust to do what they said they were going to do, someone who had the ability to do what they wanted to do, and someone who do what they said they were going to do, and who had the ability to do what they were tasked to do, and that people generally enjoy working with, overall, and was a good fit with the team. And I think some of these issues, frankly, come down to character issues, where sometimes you can have, it's not just chiefs, it could be directors, and frankly, it can be press secretaries or people, in the middle of the org chart, who like to overreach beyond their authority or be seen as the broker or the power broker or the person that makes things happen and tries to get the credit. And I think, that advice, I would just encourage everyone to really heed that advice, to listen to what your team has to say, and not, if you are in a position where you have been given the authority to make decisions, make sure you haven't overlooked your team. So that's great. Thank you. Next, a question from Stephen A. It says, does the chief need to be super partisan?
I think a chief of staff needs to have some very serious on-the-ground political experience, extended on-the-ground political experience, and not just in the past. It is so important to leave your ivory tower at times, get out there, do some more door knocking. And I'm going to make a point in a second that I hope is heard in context. It's super important to stay connected to what's happening on the ground. You can make incredible errors of judgment in not understanding the reality of, and I'll use the expression, everyday Canadians. I'd like to think I'm an everyday Canadian in some way. Maybe I wasn't when I was a chief of staff. you come back into family life and mortgages and running a business, and you suddenly revisit a lot of attitudes you had in government simply because you were missing on the ground facts. The closer you can get back to that experience regularly, it's important. For me, it was going to campaigns. I campaigned in PEI 2 elections in a row in winnable ridings that we didn't win. You can see the ebb and flow of opinion and the rough and tumble of the contest of local candidates, and it's the doorsteps over and over again, hearing what real people care about and judging the delta between that and what we cared about in Ottawa, like not just at public safety, at PMO, in the system. And these things were often not fully in alignment. So that's a healthy thing to stay grounded. At the same time, I'm of the view that people who inhabit ministers' offices should be the brightest and the best. They should be amongst the most highly trained people in the country. And I don't just mean in politics. I mean academically, experientially. They should have a diversity of experience. It's one of the concerns I have with going straight from the conservative internship program to chief of staff. No breaks, no other experiences. Yeah, you're going to be really, really powerful and good in certain ways. And in other ways, you may well be missing experiences that you need in order to step back from partisanship. I would say draw a distinction between being political, as in trying to govern based on small c conservative principles and being very dedicated to those on the one hand, and being partisan on the other. In a department where you have a heavy number of statutory authorities, including with penal consequence, you've got to be able to keep the partisanship appropriately ring fenced so you don't make the kinds of terrible errors that you've seen other people make.
All right. Last question from the chat is from Vincent. He's asking, what about the role of humor? Does dealing with problems all the time have to be a bummer?
So we had 2 traditions in our former office that I thought were brilliant. And Vincent may or may not have been an excellent participant in these traditions. One of them was when you were departing, you had to give your highlight and your low light. You had to give your best of times and worst of times. Best of times were often incredibly funny. Worst of times were often things that, if you're being honest, nobody wanted to talk about again. But it really sort of brought us back. That person's departing to go to PMO or to go back to school or what have you. And it was an awesome moment of just like reliving the times that were. The other game we love to play was one involving, and I think this is the right term, the manifest destiny in a name. Inmates in our correctional system often had names that you would swear predestined them to lives of criminality. We could debate this for hours. These were often reported on publicly. You had a fellow by the last name Mountain, who had absolutely, it's 500 pounds. Again, all reported publicly, and it flattened the correctional guard who was escorting him on a temporary absence. We said to ourselves, that was bound to happen. The names went on and on and on, and it was a tremendous amount of good fun. And we regularly played that game. We had a lot of fun as an office and spent a lot of social time together. And that made a huge difference because you had to be able to debrief on some pretty horrific days. And there was no better group of people to do that with.
Yeah. Well, as someone with the last name Outhouse, I really hope that is not not found to be true.
You have transcended.
Yes. Quick lightning round, Andrew, because I know we're coming up on our time here, so we'll just do these just very rapid fire before we let you go and let everyone get on with the rest of their evening. Most proud accomplishment from your time in government?
Controversial, but the anti-terrorism legislation that was brought in after the attack in 2015 was an absolute all hands on deck exercise. We worked so seamlessly with officials. The political staff were absolutely on their game every hour of every day for months on end. Really pleased with what we built there.
Mm-hmm. And what about maybe I want to say a big miss, but something that maybe you thought, in hindsight, you wish you'd spend a bit more time on or more focus on?
So while we were fighting the terrorists and monitoring what was going on with the Chinese, we utterly missed the reality that a woman dies in Canada every 6 days at the hands of an intimate partner.
Mm.
I never heard this stat. I was never briefed on it. I blame no one but myself. The stats were there. If a terrorist was killing a fellow Canadian citizen every 6 days,
6 days, yeah.
we would move heaven and earth. We would mobilize every resource at our disposal, and we would make it stop.
Mm.
And we did not. We were not on top of that. And that will always be a source of shame. And it's something I've tried to focus on in my current legal career in a pro bono sense. Not something corporate law firms do regularly. We do. And we think it's important not to look away.
Wow. That's kind of sobering. I maybe shouldn't end with that one. So I'll just bring this back. But thank you for sharing that. That is, I think, just a stark reminder of the. Look, we talk about this from a partisan perspective. Like, we want to win. We want to win. We want to win. This is what it grants you the opportunity and the privilege to do, is to look into issues that affect the lives of actual people. And try to make it better. And as conservatives, we certainly have views on, how government policy and things should go or shouldn't go. But at its core, it's still about what's going to help people the most. And, I think just what you've said there is just a real important reminder. It's not always about, the win on election day. There's so much more after that. Final thing is just, what's final word you'd say to anyone that's looking to kind of get into the staffing world? Maybe looking down the road here, what might happen after a federal win, or we have governments and legislatures across the country, Alberta, Ontario, etc. Manitoba's up for re-election right now. What advice would you give them? Final piece.
Just let me repeat something I said earlier. If you enter one of these jobs, it probably will be one of the most fun, but also one of the most brutal and one of the most important things you will ever do. Respect the office, and then respect yourself enough to make it end. It's not a career. It is an act of service that you may come back to several times across your life in different capacities. Make sure that you decompress from it regularly. I stayed in the game for 10 years and it was way too long. I was really fortunate to be able to transition to something else in the hope of someday contributing again. Getting the right advice as you get in, including what that arc looks like, is exactly the reason, Steve, I'm going to say it again, that people ought to speak to someone like you about how to navigate this and have a plan so that you don't just stumble from one thing to the next. That always ends badly. Have a plan, including a plan to get out when the time is right.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thanks, Andrew. So this is going to bring our time to an end this evening. Stay tuned for we'll be sharing some details very soon about our next webinar. We've been really focusing on the government side of things. I think you're going to start to see a few more campaign-based ones coming up here in the next little bit. So if you're interested in being a candidate or being a campaign manager or taking on other campaign roles, stay tuned for that. Especially that's going to be, we're going to start having some Right Recruiter webinars on that as well. Andrew, I want to thank you for your time here this evening. Great insights, very helpful. You have a wealth of knowledge and experience. You do have a great sense of humor. So I'm thankful for Vincent for raising that question. And thanks for coming and being here to share that with everyone here this evening.
Thanks a lot, Steve, for having me. And thanks to everyone who joined us.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. And if your feedback and comments are always welcome. Take care. Have a great evening.